Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a tier list for tanks in patch 10.2 and Dragonflight Mythic Plus Season 3. I also want to talk about Mythic Plus just in general a bit, because there are some things I've really liked about how Blizzard handled Mythic Plus Season 2, and I have to be honest, I'm really disappointed by some of the things that they're doing in approaching Mythic Plus Season 3. So let's start with the basics. The 8 dungeons in Mythic Plus Season 3 are Dawn of the Infinites, which as usual is split into its first and second halves as 2 separate dungeons. Then we have Waycrest Manor and Otaldazar from BFA, Darkheart Thicket and Blackrook Hold from Legion, the Everbloom from WoD, and Throne of the Tides from Cataclysm. This is pretty much what I've expected since the announcement of Dragonflight Season 1 back in the beta. I can't remember if I ever said it on the channel or just like in Discord with friends, but yeah, when Blizzard announced that they would only be putting out half of the Dragonflight dungeons as Mythic Pluses in Season 1, with the other half of Season 1 being old dungeons, I figured they would do the same thing in Season 2, and then we would get the new Mega Dungeon in patch 10.1.5. Following that, in Season 3, we would get that Mega Dungeon as 2 Mythic Pluses alongside a full set of old dungeons. And finally, in Season 4, we're probably going to get all 8 Dragonflight dungeons and the Mega Dungeon, and it'll be a 10 dungeon season. That's my guess, but I think it's a decent one. I would be okay with that. I wouldn't mind if they just went with all old dungeons in Season 4, not doing a retread of the Shadowlands Season 4 where it's like all old Mega Dungeons either. Like, if there were 0 repeats from Dragonflight and 0 repeats from Shadowlands, that would be great.
I think the community would be a lot happier with that approach too. The variety would be nice.
In terms of the dungeons that they're using in this season, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? Most people really like Waycrest Manor. I've seen a lot of comments on our channel. I've seen a lot of chatter on Twitter and other social media with people say, LinkedIn. I'm seeing lots of people post on LinkedIn about how they're ready to go to Waycrest Manor. People are thrilled that Waycrest is coming back. And like, for me, I hated Waycrest Manor, but this is a chance to step into the same stream twice. Maybe I'll love it this time. I feel the same way about Blackrook Hold. I hated Blackrook Hold in Legion, but maybe it'll be great now. On the other hand, I loved Otaldazar and Darkheart Thicket, and I'm thrilled to play in those dungeons again. Maybe I'll like them less than I remember, but I think they'll be pretty good. I think everyone loves the Everbloom, so that should be pretty rad. And WoD dungeons in general just are pretty great. I've liked every one of them, and even though some of them have been quite hard, I still really enjoyed them. I really wish they would bring Skyreach back already. I think that's controversial, but whatever. It's an all-time favorite dungeon for me. And then finally we have Throne of the Tides, which is pretty surprising. I really like that dungeon, so it's totally fine, but it's shocking that they went with that one. I really expected they would run like Lost City of the Told Veer, or some of the more dragon-themed dungeons like Grim Butthole or End Time. Throne of the Tides is a real curveball, but I don't hate it. It's a fun dungeon, should be good, just surprising. Maybe the biggest bummer here in terms of dungeon selection is that we're once again getting retreads of Legion and BFA stuff, like a lot of those, and no MoP dungeons.
I think a lot of people consider MoP a golden age of dungeons in WoW history. I know I feel that way.
And the fact that we got Temple of the Jade Serpent, maybe my least favorite MoP dungeon, I think maybe the worst one, and then that's just it forever, kind of disappointing. And yes, I am saying I liked Gate of the Setting Sun and Siege of Nizhal Temple with a stupid gong more than Jade Serpent. I really don't think it's all that controversial, but seriously, Stormstout Brewery, Shadowpan Monastery, Mogashan Palace, these are all like S-tier dungeons. They should be brought back. I did 4 seasons of, I don't know, Temple of Sethralus. I don't want to ever go back there again. Bring back MoP dungeons already.
But even though I've taken a bit of a whiny tone here at the start, the dungeon selection isn't a problem with Season 3 for me. I would have liked more variety, bit more old stuff, but I am okay with what we're getting. I think by the end of a season, you're going to be a little like bored by having done the same dungeon hundreds of times, regardless of what it is. So even if you're thrilled in the first 2 weeks, by the end, you're going to feel about the same. So I'm okay with it. The real disappointment I have is what Blizzard is doing with affixes in Season 3. Nothing. They made huge changes in Season 2, and I think they have been a phenomenal success. I want more of that in Season 3. The implication that Blizzard gave, and maybe they never explicitly stated it, maybe they just implied it, but I feel like they even said it, was that this was just the first step of many toward refining and working on affixes in Mythic Plus, and making it so that you feel like you're playing the dungeons, not the affixes. And then they just leave everything the same for another season. Are you ready to do Sanguine Waycrest Manor? Sounds like absolute garbage, doesn't it? Well, too bad. I really find it hard to believe that with the addition of affixes in Season 2, like Afflicted and Corporeal, and how heavily those favor some classes over others, that Blizzard would just be like, fine with how that worked out and make no changes. Sorry, Warrior and DK, sucks to suck. Play something else on those weeks or get somebody who's willing to carry you. All that negativity aside, I stand by it. I think Season 2 was a phenomenal success. I like all of the affixes in the game right now, or at least don't hate them, except for Sanguine. I think they're all basically fine, except for Sanguine, which is awful. Sanguine sucks. I hate Sanguine. Have I mentioned that Sanguine is really bad? Incorporeal and Afflicted are a class utility issue, but Sanguine is the only affix still in the game that is just like legitimately badly made. And the fact that it's going to remain exactly as it is for another season is a significant disappointment to me. There are so many other more interesting mechanisms for designing it, or just simply capping the amount of healing that it could do, or massively cutting down the amount of time that it's active, or removing the healing entirely, or there are just so many other better ways that it could function than to just be like an AoE lay on hands for half of every dungeon that you're in, so that even on a tyrannical dungeon, you're doing like 3 times as much trash damage as you would in a fortified dungeon. It sucks. Okay, before we move on to class utility, I just wanted to address some of the really good comments on the raid tank tier list that mentioned Close to Heart and Generous Pour. Those are the 2 monk passives that grant increased healing taken and avoidance to nearby allies, and they persist for 10 seconds when someone moves away from the monk as well. They're both really good, and I probably did underestimate their impact on monk's utility in raid, probably put monk about a point lower than it should have been. Probably should have been right up with warrior. The 10-yard range is a little restrictive in raids. A lot of the time, they're just good buffs for the melee clump, but I mean, that's still useful. And there are times where you are able to get the entire raid covered with that buff, and that's pretty great. So, good comments there, good points all around. Now let's move on to the Mythic Plus utility tier list. Alright, so now we have our tier list here. We're going to be talking about utility in dungeons for the 6 tanks. But first, I wanted to do something a little different and actually just talk about all of the affixes, all 10 of the affixes. So we're going to go back to the old Wowhead Season 2 affix changes article and talk about this. And this is a good reminder of just how good the Season 2 affix system changes really were. I mean, Explosive and Grievous used to be in the game. It's so easy to forget them because they were just so unbelievably demonic. But man, I mean, the game really has been improved by the removal of those 2. And as much as Sanguine is still very annoying, I you know, in the context of Explosive and Grievous being in the game, it's like a delight, a vacation into a pool of blood by comparison. Okay, so, you know, you have these 10 affixes: Afflicted, Incorporeal, Volcanic, Entangling, and Storming, and then Spiteful, Raging, Bursting, Bolstering, and Sanguine. And so some of them tanks are really able to play like a positive role on. Some of them you have like no impact at all. Like, you know, Bolstering and Bursting, you basically have no impact. Bear Druid, you know, potentially can like splash some healing around and help with Bursting, but that's like very, very minor. You know, stuff like Volcanic tank should have no impact on at all. So I made a little tier list out of these. I'm going to flashbang you 3, 2, 1, flashbang. Made a little tier list out of these, and this is really just like a ranking of how much of an impact a tank can and should have on dealing with these affixes. And so Sanguine, I think, is the number 1. All tanks technically aren't able to deal with Sanguine in the same way. Like, it's actually pretty disproportional, but I do think this is kind of the most important thing for tanks to be able to help out with. And then Incorporeal, and then Afflicted, I think those are kind of the 2 and 3. And then, you know, once you get down to Spiteful, Entangling, and Raging, it's pretty limited the amount of impact you're actually able to have on those 3 affixes as a tank. But technically, you could still help with crowd controlling stuff or slowing stuff on Spiteful, so like you're not totally worthless as a tank. Paladin and Druid are kind of able to have a bit of an impact on Entangling and Raging.
respectively, but it's pretty minor. They're basically just there to round out the tier list, but not really all that impactful. So let's kind of rank each tank's performance. Close your eyes. All right. We're going to kind of rank each tank's performance on each of these important affixes, and then just sort of the general overall performance in a dungeon, just, whatever affixes it is. So starting with Sanguine, I think Blood Decay pretty clearly is the number one tank at dealing with Sanguine. I think they're so far out in front of the competition. The ability to death rip stuff, the ability to spec into Gorfine's Grasp on Sanguine Week specifically, just to have more capacity to pull mobs out of the stupid Sanguine. It's pretty amazing, and it's pretty unparalleled. I think the only class that's like even really close at being able to knock stuff out of the Sanguine is Brewmaster Monk, and I think they're clearly a step behind because Death Grip's a 15-second cooldown, and it grips the mob directly to you. Ring of Peace is 45 seconds, and you can set it on top of the Sanguine so that Sanguine is not interable for mobs, and that's good. It is multi-target, but it's a much longer cooldown, and it's a lot less precise. You might scatter the mobs around or not knock them all exactly in the way you want to. Might knock them into another Sanguine pool. That's really not happening as Blood. Then you have Bear Druid with Typhoon, and that's pretty good. I would say that's maybe a step below Monk. It might be more like in a, if we're saying, SAB, whatever, but kind of a little bit of a step below Monk, I think, because Monk, you're able to set the Ring of Peace on the ground, area deny that Sanguine pool, and you can, if you're skillful and maybe a little lucky, knock mobs in a direction you want. On a Bear Druid, it's just away, so you kind of have to move around. It is a shorter cooldown, so that helps. There's some other stuff you can do, like if you have some lieutenant mobs that are CC immune, you can set like a Ursol's Vortex on a Bear Druid with other like low health mobs that would die and drop Sanguine pools. You can force them to get snapped back as you're pulling the lieutenant out. So there's a little bit more complex options there available for a Druid, a little bit more in the way of tools, but it's also a bit harder to use than a Monk, so I do think they're a little bit worse. And then Demon Hunter historically has had nothing, at least in this expansion, because getting Sigil of Chains has been pretty hard to justify, but now it's going to be really easy. So I think they're probably a step ahead of Bear Druid, just because Sigil of Chains will be available fairly often. I think it's a 90-second cooldown, if I remember correctly, but you're getting so much cooldown reduction out of all your cycle of binding, all of your usage of sigils, that I think it's going to be about on the level of Bear Druid. Pretty impactful. Warrior doesn't have anything, basically. You can try to fear mobs and hope that they run out of the Sanguine pool. You can try to, stun mobs before the Sanguine pool is spawned so that one of your party members stuns a mob. It won't be, it'll be DR'd already. It won't last as long. That's about the best you can do as a prot warrior, I think, is to get mobs on a stun DR so that when one of your party members mistakenly stuns mobs in the Sanguine, it's already immune. And then the only thing that Paladin really has is basically that same thing, the ability to stun mobs in the Sanguine, which is actively harmful. But you can silence mobs from range, so caster mobs tend to be the mobs that stand in Sanguine pools the longest. And being able to silence them out from range without having to go in and get Sanguine ticked yourself is somewhat useful. It's slightly better than the nearly worthless state of Warrior, but it's not great. I guess that's another point in favor of Demon Hunter that probably does put them ahead of Bear just a little bit, is the ability to Sigil of Silence a pack of mobs that are casters that are standing in a Sanguine pool and have them all just run out. You can do that from range, pretty good, and you don't have to position in any sort of weird way where you're typhooning them in the correct direction. That's about it. All right, so let's reset that and talk about Incorporeal. Incorporeal, you can CC as a Bear Druid. It kind of sucks. You have to actually spec into Hibernate, which you can cast in Bear form, but you do have to, actually cast it. Pally's sort of in the same boat. You can spec into Repentance, but then it's a cast time. I really would rather just have somebody else do it and, just not help with the Incorporeal and be able to keep Blinding Light. So, Pally, you can waste your Avenger shields on the Incorporeal mobs, but you're not going to get any damage out of the hits on the Incorporeal mobs, which is pretty frustrating. You can Hammer of Justice them, so that's okay. Prot Warrior's kind of in the same boat. You can... I don't remember the name of the talent, and I'm just going to look it up. But there is a talent that synergizes with Intimidating Shout. It's called, I want to say Menace? Yeah, Man-Ass. There we go. So you can spec into Menace, and that turns your Intimidating Shout into a 15-second fear. Now, it has the annoying component of knocking all nearby enemies back. But a 15-second fear on an incorporeal mob is enough to lock them down the whole time. You know, if they start their cast, you hit them with a menaced, intimidating shout, they'll be feared for 15 seconds, and then once it breaks, they'll start their cast again, and then it'll despawn before the cast ends. So Warrior's able to deal with one incorporeal ad every 90 seconds if you take this otherwise very, very bad talent, which it's an option. So I think Warrior's okay at it, probably about on the level of Bear. You know, you're having to spec differently, kind of weirdly, and use a talent that's not all that great, but you can sort of help. Compare that with Monk and Demon Hunter, who can just hit them with a paralysis or an imprison, and then they're just like banished to the Nether Realm. That's pretty great. And there was a while where Blood DK was able to control undead or whatever, but I think that was killed. I don't know. I haven't tried to do it. I don't want to spec into control undead to try. I know that priests can mind control them, and that tends to work a lot nicer anyway. So whenever I'm on the Blood DK, I basically just don't even try to help with incorporeal. It's basically the exact opposite of Sanguine, where I feel like, hey, you know, this is my job. I'm gonna alter my talent setup to really control these mobs. In the case of incorporeal, I want nothing to do with it when I'm on the Blood DK. I'm just doing my own thing, staying alive, and letting somebody else do that job. When we talk about Afflicted, this is really just a lot more straightforward. You know, these three guys can all defensively dispel, so they're all in great shape. These three guys can't defensively dispel. All they can do is say, "Good job, healer," and then that's that's pretty much it. Spiteful tanks have a bit more of an impact on, you know, Monk's always slowing everything, and you can set a Ring of Peace, and then that's a complete safe zone for your party. On a Bear Druid, you have Typhoon, you have Ursol's Vortex. That's pretty great. You know, multiple ways to lock down packs of mobs. You can even, like, hit them with a Feral Charge, Wild Charge, and root a Spiteful mob in place, so that's nice. You know, you got plenty of AoE CC on all the rest of the classes. Obviously, Blood DK can grip mobs away, slow them. Like, I would say all of the tanks are in pretty great shape at being able to CC and control and root and stun and slow and so on all of these Spiteful mobs. It probably looks like this. I think these four tanks up top all have, like, really good either, like, slow or AoE crowd control or whatever skills. And these two guys don't have great slow options. You can get slows, but you know, you kind of have to go out of your way a little bit talent-wise to get slows that are sort of impactful on Spiteful mobs. So it could look like this if you're talenting correctly, but you have to actually adjust your talents to get slows on these guys, where these four, you get them, you know, by default. Entangling is pretty much a two mob pack. You know, I guess like Bear Druid can give people Stampeding Roar, that kind of helps a little bit, but really it's just Paladin can freedom like the healer usually. I don't need a GeForce driver update right now. Paladin can freedom the healer, which is pretty impactful at a lot of points on some of the more difficult tyrannical fights, being able to like freedom somebody who has a lot of mobility constraints or just really needs to stand still and heal right now and doesn't need that disruption of having to leave a circle. That's pretty good. And you also freedom yourself by doing that, you know, with whatever the name of the talent is. We're going to look at that rather than say I can't remember. It's called Unbound Freedom. There it is. Yeah, I mean, that's such an amazing must-have talent. And I love it. And, you know, Monk can Tiger's Lust somebody else, but, you know, usually you're probably going to do that to yourself. And then you have Stampeding Roar, and then the other three, basically no impact. And then finally, Raging, Bear Druid can remove it. Nobody else can do anything. All right, now let's talk about how the tanks actually compare in terms of, like, real utility to the group. So most of the defensive utility, the stuff like Rallying Cry, the stuff like the AoE healing increase for monks, what is that called? Again, I can never remember anything now. I've reached the point of being an old man that I can't remember anything close to heart. I was just talking about this a minute ago. Those really aren't as impactful in Mythic Plus because a lot of those things are like force multipliers where it has this great multiplying effect in Raid where everybody's optimized towards tons of AoE healing. But in Mythic Plus, you're really only getting one person who's doing a lot of healing, 8% more on the relatively limited amount. Just doesn't wind up being that impactful. Certainly not enough to like
you're not taking a monk over another tank because, oh, we're going to get 8% more healing for our awesome Mythic Plus healing parses. Nobody's thinking about it like that. You're thinking mainly about crowd control. You're thinking about, specific impactful defensive options like the ability to Blessing of Spell Warding, some sort of mechanic maybe. But mostly it's about like crowd control. It's about the ability to make all of the caster mobs in every dungeon take a permanent vow of silence. And so for that, I think the top two very clearly are these two bad boys right here. Prop Paladin with their ability to silence every caster mob in sight, and Vengeance Demon Hunter with their ability to AoE silence packs of mobs, and now that they're getting tons of cooldown reduction on all of their sigils, and they're able to pick up Sigil of Chains really easily, and Sigil of Misery is free now. You just have so many forms of AoE crowd control. Now, if I were to really think about it and try to like specifically delineate between these two, it probably does look a bit more like this, where it's like, Paladin is like S+, and Vengeance Demon Hunter is like S tier. Like, they're both exceptionally good. Demon Hunter has so much crowd control. You have Paralysis, you have AoE Stun, you have AoE Fear, you have AoE Silence, you have Sigil of Chains, you have 2 charges on all of those sigils as well. You have the potential for single target dispel. You have AoE dispel if you're a Blood Elf, which you often are. Like, all of that is incredibly powerful, incredibly good stuff. And it's easy to use. I think that's maybe the biggest differentiator between Demon Hunter and Paladin, is it's a lot easier to hit that like skill cap on a Demon Hunter. All of your stuff is focused on the enemies that you're fighting against. You're able to think about it like a DPS or like a normal tank. You're not having to think about things like a healer. You can just slam all your buttons, CC the guys, not have to look at party frames. You're playing at 100%. The difference is that Paladin has things like Blessing of Sacrifice on a 1-minute cooldown, which is insane for dealing with like focused damage on a hunter, somebody who's struggling to stay alive, a healing priest. There's just so much defensive utility. Blessing of Spell Warding, Blessing of Protection, if the ability to press Divine Shield and AoE Taunt, even though that kind of that sort of trends more into like actual power, like that certainly is an incredible utility as well. The ability to just remove debuffs from yourself that other tanks don't have. And look, they're able to spam silence on caster mobs from range all the time. Like, that's a pretty unbeatable utility, and I think you do generally get, if you're thinking about like each pack having 1 or maybe 2 caster mobs, you're getting a lot more uptime on your silence as a Paladin than you are as a Demon Hunter. Where Demon Hunter really kind of takes the lead in their ability to crowd control casters, specifically silencing casters, is when you have like 3+ casters in each pack. Where a Paladin isn't able to get all of them by themselves. But that's not usually how Mythic Plus pulls are structured. There's usually 1 or 2 casters, rarely like 4, and so that just tends to be a bit more advantageous for Paladin. Beyond that, everybody else kind of pales in comparison. Like, the ability to death grip mobs, the ability to AoE crowd control with Blinding Sleet or whatever it's called, pretty good. There's a lot of great utility for Blood Decay. Everybody loves it. But it's not the same as being able to like blanket silence every caster mob in the world. Again, I feel the same way about Brewmaster Monk. Paralysis is good. Leg Sweep is great. Ring of Peace is amazing. The ability to dispel is good. Roll can be good in a lot of situations. Tiger's Lust is good. There's a lot of great stuff here. It's a great class. Not as good as the top 2. And Bear Druid, I think maybe the one thing that could compete with the stuff that these two guys are bringing up top here is Bear Druid's ability to do a lot of healing. Bear Druid brings a wild amount of group healing through After the Wildfire. It also has a lot of the stuff that makes Brewmaster Monk great. It has Knockback, it has Ursol's Vortex, which is like a totally unique form of crowd control, keeping mobs stuck in an area when you have mobs that are trying to jump around, fixate on people. Spiteful, that kind of thing. It's really, really amazing to have that sort of unique power. You also have just basic stuff like Incapacitating Roar, nice little 30-second cooldown AoE CC. We love that kind of thing. And I think, that's all pretty good. They also have Decurse, which is unique among tanks, and they have De-Enrage, which is also unique among tanks. So Bear Druid probably is like ahead, like A+ in this list, a slight step above the other three. But I would say in general, the utility brought by all tanks is pretty good. It's just that you have these two that really stand out because of their ability to annihilate caster mobs. And finally, Prot Warrior, historically I've always thought of them as being like the stun machine, the best stun guy. I think they've kind of fallen behind on that a little bit. They have more stuns, a larger number of stuns in Stormbolt and Shield Charge, both as single target stuns, and Shockwave as an AoE stun. And they have Intimidating Shout. So they have like an AoE CC, but Shockwave is a 2-second stun. It's not really useful as like a long-term stun. It's more of like a interrupt that works even on stuff that's not interruptible. And when you look at Prot Warrior's two main stuns, which would be Shield Charge and Stormbolt, they're two single target stuns, they really aren't as good as the stuns that you're getting from Prot Paladin, Hammer of Justice. Hammer of Justice, 6 seconds. Stormbolt, 4. Shield Charge, I think 4. One of those things where you suddenly realize you don't remember. How long is Shield Charge a stun? 4. Okay, so yeah, 6 seconds is longer than 4. You also have AoE CC from Prot Paladin and just generally more crowd control from Prot Paladin, while also bringing a bunch of defensive utility. I think Prot Paladin ultimately pulls ahead. This is a relatively close field. I think closer maybe than a lot of the raid utility comparisons, a lot of the later discussion that I'm about to get to of like actual relative power level in Mythic Plus. But there's clearly like an upper echelon, and then the rest of the pack is like pretty competitive, but a step behind. All right, now we're going to talk about just relative tank power level in Mythic Plus. This is the actual proper real tier list of Mythic Plus tanks. And first things first, I'm going to talk about Blood DK, and something that I saw as a comment in the raid tank tier list video, a couple of spots was, the legendary that's coming in this patch. It's a strength two-handed axe. So, obviously that means that of the 6 tanks, the only one that's going to be able to use it while tanking, at least without, severely impairing themselves, is Blood DK. And the reason I didn't really factor that into the raid tank tier list at all is presumably the unlock mechanism is going to be just like the Evoker legendary was, where a guild has to actually finish the world first kill first, and then that's like a guaranteed drop on the world first kill, and then after that it becomes a chance to drop with higher chance on higher difficulty. But because of that, it's not really that big of a factor in like Mythic progression. Basically, you probably won't have it until you finish the raid on Mythic. Probably. It's possible, but probably won't be available to most people until they finish the raid on Mythic. At least not until the raid has been out for several months. So because of that, I just didn't really think it was that big of a factor in raid tier list making, because so much of raid thought processes are concentrated into the first couple of weeks while that race to world first is occurring, and maybe a couple of weeks after, but like the first month of the raid is really when people are thinking about this is the relative power of stuff in the raid. That's not really how Mythic Plus works. People think about Mythic Plus like in a much longer term sort of thought process. And I really like that. Like, that is one of the things about Mythic Plus that I like. But, like, you come into Mythic Plus not really planning, like, oh, yeah, this is going to be the best thing in the first 2 weeks. You're thinking about the full 3, 4, 5 month season when you're looking at it. And so I think that Blood DK's access to the Legendary is going to have way more of an impact on its value in Mythic Plus going into that second month. Now, because of that, it's going to add a lot of damage. It's just a big old item level increase in addition to having, like, actual value as a legendary, which is pretty rad. I think it probably will zoot them up quite a bit in terms of damage output. The problem with Blood DK that has always been in Mythic Plus is just eventually it hits a point where it has difficulty staying alive at the start of hard pulls, and once you reach a certain level in Mythic Plus, every start of every pull becomes hard. There's also the issue that their tier set works really well in single target and like small scale cleave because it's applied by Heartstrike, and it's extended by Heartstrike and Blood Boil, but it's not applied by Blood Boil. So you have a cap of 5 targets that you're able to apply the damage and damage reduction debuff to. Now it is also applied by Abomination Limb, so you're able to get AoE on it on a 2-minute cooldown, which helps a lot for some of the more difficult pulls in Mythic Plus. So I think the DK will probably fare fairly well in Mythic Plus in Season 3, but compared to like the Season 2 tier set, which gave them a lot of extra power and just uptime on Vampiric Blood, I think it's kind of a step down if you're just looking at comparing the like 2 designs in Mythic Plus. The Vampiric Blood one was a lot more omnipresent and just sort of like more generically valuable in Mythic Plus, even if it maybe wasn't as good in terms of total damage output and damage reduction. And that's not a great sign for Blood DK, considering that they weren't even like dominant or really like great in Mythic Plus in Season 2 either. They were good, they were fine, and I think Blood DK will be good to fine before the Legendary and probably like good to great once you have that Legendary available to you. But I don't think they're going to be the top dog tank by any stretch of the imagination. I think they're going to be upper middle of the pack, which, yeah, that's maybe not ideal for a tank that's getting a Legendary just all for themselves. You also have to like, you have to get lucky and actually get the Legendary on a Blood DK as opposed to going to the dumb Fury Warrior or whatever, which, you know, I'm sure that's going to be happening a bunch for Blood DKs. I presumably it'll be the same as the Evoker Legendary, where it just appears in your bag and stuff, and it can be like traded or anything. You're not going to be forced into giving it away to a DPS, which is good, but still, you have to actually get it. It's pretty hard. I never got the Evoker Legendary on my stupid Evoker, so, you know, may not happen. And obviously, if you're gambling on that happening to, like, not even be the best tank in the game, it doesn't feel like a great gamble. Now, if we look at Brewmaster Monk, Brewmaster is like always kind of mid to bad in Mythic Plus. They have a lot of good utility. That, you know, I mean, all of the tanks work really well up to a certain point, right? You know, you can do up to 25s relatively easy. I don't know what relatively means, but, you know, relatively effectively, you can do up into the mid-20s pretty well in all the tanks. And then once you get into the like really high levels of key pushing, that's where the degree of hyper optimization weeds out the weaker tanks. But they all work pretty well up to a certain point. And I think that Brewmaster Monk is still kind of in that same boat as always. Their tier set bonuses don't really add a ton of damage. You know, it's less than 10% more damage even in the ideal optimal AoE situation as they're currently made. They're better suited defensively than the Season 2 tier set bonuses were, which is good. You do get like 15% leech on average in Mythic Plus, which winds up being a lot of healing, and best of all, it is a steady stream of healing, which is what Brewmasters need. You really just need to be able to like reduce the amount of healing burden that your healer has to constantly pour into you all the time on a Brewmaster Monk. So I think that this will probably be a step up for Brewmaster Monk compared to normal, but I still think they're going to be behind the top, obviously, and I think they're even going to probably be about a middle of the pack tank. I don't think they'll be the worst tank in Mythic Plus, but I don't think they're going to be the best either. I think that their tier set bonuses are just kind of disappointing. Now, it's very possible, I've been railing about this a lot because their tier set bonus sucks so bad in single target that maybe the tier set gets like a nice big buff. And if the 4-piece gets a buff where its damage contribution is increased, like if it got doubled or tripled, then Brewmaster Monk immediately jumps right up to the Blood DK level, because that has a knock-on effect to every other aspect of the tier set. If the tier set did more damage, it would do massively more healing, which would vastly increase Monk's viability in Mythic Plus. It would also improve all the other aspects of their tier set and a lot of the other aspects of their kit just in general. Unfortunately, it's undertuned right now, and so I think that they're probably going to be a little underwhelming. I think the design's good. I think the class is good. I think it's capable of great stuff, but the tuning isn't there right now, and until it is, I think it's going to be disappointing. I would say almost the exact opposite is true for Bear Druid. I think the Bear Druid is mechanically pretty good. I really like all the aspects of their kit, and even though they're losing basically like 15% more damage, rage, and health by losing their old tier set going into the next season, you know, they're getting a tier set that in Mythic Plus actually works fairly well. It gives you a pretty good shielding, basically another defensive cooldown that applies as soon as your Rage of the Sleeper ends and stays up most of the way until your next Rage of the Sleeper is up. That's pretty good. And getting extra uptime on your Rage of the Sleeper is good. It's all fine. It's sort of boring. And the damage numbers are okay. 15 or so % more damage in AoE, I think, something like that. Maybe a little bit more with more optimized play than I was doing on like training dummies. But I don't know, mechanically it's a little boring. And I just don't love it. I think that Blizzard made a pretty clear intentional effort to knock Bear Druids down a peg because they made the mistake of buffing them in the back half of a Mythic Plus season to like a pretty enormous, egregious degree, really. And so now they've kind of overcorrected and really like kicked them in the teeth because they were good for 3 months. It's the classic Bear Druid story. They were good for less than half of an expansion, time to suck for a couple of years. I still think that the underlying class is pretty fun. I like it. I'm definitely going to continue playing it. That's true of all the tanks, but I'm going to continue enjoying Bear Druid, and I think it's probably going to be a hidden gem, an underrated gem, but you know, it's already had its chance to like, this is the great class that you should be playing, and you're not doing it. And then they spark up in popularity for 2 or 3 months, and then they immediately get super turbo nuked into oblivion, and now here they are, kind of a smoldering crater left behind by Blizzard's over-nerfing cannons. All right, now we're talking Prop Pally. They immediately get S tier. We all know what Prop Paladin is at this point. They have Final Stand, which is bananas. It's the best defensive cooldown in the game. They have Avenger Shield, the best, like, most consistent crowd control in the game. Just you demolish, you turn off caster's ability to cast anything. You have a limited amount of group healing, but, you know, you have some pretty good group defensive cooldowns. We're talking Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Spell Warding, Blessing of Protection. You have good crowd control skills other than Avenger Shield. Hammer of Justice. Blinding Light. It's a great class. What more do you want from me about Paladin? I've already said everything that needs to be said about it. It's goated. It's always going to be a top tier tank. They really, really have to just like make it truly abominable to play for it to not be good with all of the stuff that it has in its utility toolkit. And they haven't done that. People hate the state of consecration. I know a lot of people really like to complain about consecration, but I think in Mythic Plus it's not nearly as bad, except for on Sanguine weeks. I think it really functions just fine. In Mythic Plus, it's more in Raid where I feel like you're forced to move a lot more often out of the consecration. Still hate it though. I'm not a fan, but I think it works okay. And I think their tier set will probably be pretty good in Mythic Plus too. You know, we're averaging 6 to 8% more damage reduction and getting a lot of AoE damage out of the consecration in Mythic Plus. It's not too shabby. Prot Warrior, I think, is bound for a resurgence. You know, initially when I was looking at the tier sets before we'd kind of solved any of the numbers and stuff, and while the Prot Warrior tier set was still being worked on, I thought that Prot Warrior was kind of going to be in this, like, lower range. I didn't think it would be all that great. Then they did the big redesign and turned it into an average of, like, 14 to 15% damage reduction. That's up pretty often, about like 80 to 90% of the time, and it adds quite a lot of single target damage. And then they added the cooldown reduction to Thunderous Roar as well, and that has really got me excited to play Prot Warrior. Like, I think it's maybe the most fun tank to play. The playstyle alteration of your Shield Slams instantly resetting Thunderclap can't be underestimated. Like, I think I wrote this already into the Prot Warrior guide that'll be coming out in a little while. I'm so in love with this tier set already that I am already prepared like preparing to and even making the case that it should be added as a talent after this expansion ends. Like, it's not even live yet. I'm already in love with it to the point that I need it to stick around. This is a tier set bonus that needs to be incorporated into the class. Keeping the ability to immediately reset Thunderclap with Shield Slam feels so perfect in the Prot Warrior rotation. Cooldown reduction, cooldown resetting is so iconically Prot Warrior, and this tier set just does everything to magnify all of the things that you love about Prot Warrior. It's got damage reduction, it's got damage, it's got bleed stuff, it's got cooldown reduction. You don't need anything else. And, you know, it's amazing. I'm really, really, really in love with the state of Prot Warrior going into this upcoming season. Again, like, I really thought the Brewmaster Monk was going to be up there with the fact that they're getting like a steady healing tier set bonus, but the single target damage numbers on it just suck so bad that it really can't be up in that sort of upper mid tier. Whereas Prot Warrior is in amazing shape. And then finally, we got Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Vengeance Demon Hunter we need to make a new list for, a new line for. We're gonna call that nope, we're gonna call this S, and this is S plus Turbo. Yeah, that's where Demon Hunter goes. You know, it doesn't have quite the defensive utility of Paladin. I mean, nobody does. It doesn't have the single target concentrated silencing capabilities of Paladin, because nobody does. It doesn't have the ability to deal damage from range like Paladin, because nobody does. What it does have is layers upon layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of damage reduction. Really good uptime on some really, like, useful defensive cooldowns. You know, we're talking about things like Fiery Brand and Metamorphosis and Fell Devastation. All of these things that are interacting with each other to give you a lot of added damage reduction and healing and extra health. And then just damage. I mean, it's just shreds. You get 100% uptime without that much difficulty on Fiery Sigil of Flame, which gives you 20% parry. When you factor in the parry chance that you get from Demon Spikes and the base parry chance that you have on the class, you're sitting at over 50% parry all the time. This is preposterous. This is in like 450 item level gear too, which is very bad relative to Season 3. You know, if I were like actually in like 470, 480 item level gear, that parry chance is probably in the 60s. And then once they get through the parry chance, you know, if they're able to actually land a hit, you have a ton of armor thanks to Demon Spikes and potentially Metamorphosis and so on. Like, you have a lot of damage reduction as well. You have things like Painbringer, you have Calcified Spikes. I mean, it's just a class that's going to be really hard to kill. You can potentially have around 100% uptime on Demon Spikes, depending on your talent setup and how quickly you're able to generate soul fragments. The only real downside to Demon Hunter is it's not the same class that you've been used to in the past. There's a pretty big adjustment required. So, like, whether you think that's good or bad is really just a matter of your, like, own personal opinion. Did you like the class before? No? Well, congratulations. You're gonna love the new thing because it's very different. It's very sigil heavy. Did you like the class before? Yes? Well, too bad. It's changed. I mean, that really is kind of the split there on whether you're gonna prefer Demon Hunter or Paladin, but I think it's pretty clear the whole community is lined up behind the new hotness, and that is Demon Hunter. It does a ton of damage. It has amazing defensive, or I should say offensive utility in the form of tons of crowd control, tons of AoE CC and grip and so on. It's very, very hard to kill. There's like I don't know where this comes from, the idea that Demon Hunter has trouble with AoE threat. I've always found this preposterous. I've always found it to be like maybe literally the easiest tank to generate AoE threat on. Not necessarily the best at doing it. Prot Warrior, you press Avatar, charge in Thunderclap. That's pretty easy to do. But in terms of actually generating AoE threat, you know, you throw a Sigil of Flame out, leap in and hit Immolation Aura, you Demon Spikes along the way. That's really not that complicated. And when mobs, say, stream through a pack and you have Immolation Aura up, it ticks on them once, it stops going for the healer and turns to you. this is something that most other tanks don't have. Rushing Jadewind is about the only thing that's really comparable to it, Rushing Jadewind and spinning Crane Kick, but I've always found that Immolation Aura really just one of the best tools at scooping up packs of ads that are kind of running around frantically. And now you have tons more availability on Sigil of Flame. You just have so much more AoE damage than you already had as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. I mean, really, it is, once again, a case of the rich getting much, much richer here. So I think the future is looking pretty incredible for Vengeance Demon Hunter going into Season 3. This isn't controversial at all. Everybody loves Vengeance Demon Hunter, and I'm super excited to play the new one. Like, having gone back and played the old version a bit after dabbling with it on the PTR, I can't wait for the new one. I definitely don't miss the old version of it. Obviously, the old tier set for Vengeance was super powerful. That probably is the biggest thing I want to like end on, and that probably is the biggest issue with Vengeance Demon Hunter going into the season, and why I really wanted to start out by talking about the long-termism of Mythic Plus tier list and ranking compared to other, compared to Raid. The first couple of weeks of Mythic Plus on a Vengeance Demon Hunter, your tier set is massively nerfed. It's like 1/6 as strong as it used to be. And you don't have the new tier set yet. So the first couple of weeks, they will be worse. I don't think that they'll actually be worse. I think that the talent changes are enough of a buff to compensate and like actually overcompensate for the tier set nerfs. But you will be wearing a tier set that completely sucks. And getting those new tier set bonuses is going to be a massive increase, like much larger increase than it is on, say, a Paladin or a Blood DK. And so that's maybe like the one thing to take away here, is that Vengeance Demon Hunter might have a slightly slower start than people are expecting, unless you're also raiding and getting your tier set bonus, like, established pretty quickly first couple of weeks. Then I think you're going to be set. But if you're just doing it through Mythic Plus and kind of counting on the weekly cash and the gear converter to get yourself that tier set, it will be a couple of weeks before Demon Hunter truly gets rolling. But then once it does, it's like a snowball. It's just going to roll downhill, smashing everything along the way. And the only thing that can stop it, I think, is Blizzard realizing that they have massively overbuffed Vengeance Demon Hunter and nerfing it. And so for me, like, the safe money, it's on Paladin, probably, but safe is boring, Demon Hunter is fun. So I'm probably going to be focusing more on Demon Hunter starting like right out the gate, try and get them tier set pieces and really like enjoy it while it's good and hot. And just hope it doesn't get nerfed, because it's buck wild. All right, that is it. I'm really excited for this upcoming Mythic Plus season. In spite of the complaining I did at the start of this video, I think it's going to be pretty fun. I think the redesigned Vengeance Demon Hunter is just so rad. And yeah, I think it's going to be pretty fun. Also, I mean, Prot Warrior shining again. Can't wait. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.